Often when you're working with forms in Django, you have to select related objects in a form field, and in this video we're going to learn how to do that with Django's model choice field. We're going to learn how to load options for foreign keys into a form field, and then we're going to use Select2 in order to make the drop-down searchable, and that will help us find the item that we need in the most efficient manner. And after we've done that, we're going to look at another Django form field. We're going to look at the model multiple choice field, and that lets you select multiple related objects in the form and attach them to that object in the database. And when we're building these forms, we're also going to use django-crispy-forms in order to make the forms look good using Bootstrap. So let's get started. I have the GitHub repository open here for the starter code. I'll leave a link to this below the video. You can clone this in order to get started. And I already have this open in VS Code, so let's bring that up. Now what we have here is two Django models. We have a car model and a user model. And you can see the user model, we're extending the Django abstract user that contains all the default user model fields, such as username and email address. We're extending that and we're adding a single additional field here, and that's the car foreign key. And that's a foreign key to the above car model. And that model is a very simple model. It contains two car fields. The first one for the manufacturer of the car, for example Ferrari, and the second is the country to which that car belongs. Now the reason that we have a car model here, if we go to the data directory that's in the starter code, we have this cars.csv file, and if I click on that, you can see the data that we're going to use in this application. We're going to populate the database with these cars, and then we're going to use a model choice field in a Django form in order to allow users who are registering to select which car they have in a drop-down. So that's the data set, and what we also have in this starter code is a management command called load cars. And this is a very simple Django management command. It contains this handle method, and we have a link to that CSV file containing the car data. And then below that, we're reading the file into memory, and for each row in that file, we're using the car.objects.get or create function in order to get that object from the database, and if it doesn't exist, create it in the database. So that's our starter code. What we're going to do now is go to forms.py, and we're going to create a form that allows a user to register into this application, and as well as some of the default fields that are on a registration form in Django, we're going to also add a model choice field in order to let the user select a car. So let's go back to the browser, and this is the manufacturers.csv file that I've already got in the starter code. I'll leave a link to this repository in the description as well. What we're going to look at now is this page here on creating a user using the Django user creation form. And this is a form that's built into Django's auth package. It's called the user creation form. So what we're going to do is go back to forms.py, and we're going to bring that form in as an import at the top here. So from django.contrib.auth.forms, we're importing the user creation form, and we're also going to bring in the user and car models from the models.py file. So let's create a new class here. It's going to be called user create form, and it's going to extend that user creation form from Django, and we're going to define a meta class underneath that there, and we're going to link this to the user model that we've created in the models.py file, and that's this model here that extends the abstract user and adds this car field to that model. So we're tying this form to the user model, and we're going to define now the fields that we want to show in the form. So we're going to show the username as well as two fields called password1 and password2, and finally we're also going to show the car field, and that's going to show that related model choice field in the form. If we go back quickly to the documentation for the user creation form, you can see that it inherits from the base user creation form, and if we scroll up to that particular form class, you can see some more details on what this is. It's a model form for creating a new user, and this is the recommended base class if you need to customize the user creation form. And you can see that this model form has three fields: the username, the password1 and password2 field. And by default, the form will verify that password1 and password2 match, and then it will also validate the password with the validate password function, and it's going to set the password with the set password function. And that's important because it's going to take the raw password and it's going to hash that. So when you're extending these forms, you don't need to worry about the password hashing logic. So if we go back to VS Code, we're creating a form called user create form that is extending that user creation form, and we're referencing the free fields in that form, and we're adding another field, and that's the car foreign key. What we now need to do is add this form to our view context. So let's go to views.py, and at the top here I'm going to bring in from the core.forms module that new form that we've just created, and then to the context dictionary we're going to add a key called form, and we're just going to instantiate that new form object. Now you can see that the return method for this view is rendering this particular template called register.html. So if we go to the templates directory, we're going to go to register.html, and you can see at the moment we just have an h1 tag. What we need to do below that is create a form tag in HTML, and we're going to give this a method of post, so that when we submit this, it's going to send a post request to the Django server. And of course, when we're sending a post request, we need to also include the CSRF token, so we're going to add that template tag there. And then below that, we're going to take the form that we have in our context, and we're going to render that using the asDiv property, and that's going to create each field in the form on a new line. And finally, I'm going to add a button here, and that's a submit button that's going to submit the data from the form to the server. So the next step here would be to run the server, but before we do that, I'm going to run the Django manage.py-migrate command, and that's going to create the SQLite database in this application. And what we can then do is we can run python manage.py, and we're going to run that custom management command that we have in the management folder. It's called load cars, and that's going to load all of those cars from the CSV file into the database. And I've referenced load CSV, that should be load cars, and that's going to then load all of those cars into the database. And once that load cars command has finished, we can go to the Django shell, and I'm going to run a query here, that's car.objects.all, and we're going to see that that returns a query set of car objects. And if we run car.objects.all and chain the .count function to that, it returns the number of cars in the database, and we can see that there's 43 cars, and that hopefully matches what we have in this CSV file. So let's open that file, and if we scroll down, you can see we have 43 rows of data. So that matches, all of these cars are now loaded into the database. Let's now exit the shell, and we're going to start the Django development server, and we're now going to go to the browser. And you can see the form that we have on the browser here. It's not the best looking form, but the important field to look at is this car field at the bottom. And you can see that that has loaded in all of these objects for the cars that have been loaded into the database. But you can see that the string representation of these is not ideal, just says car object along with the primary key of that car. We're going to change that now by going back to models.py, and I'm going to add a dunder string method to the car model. That's going to take self as an argument, and we're going to return the manufacturer of the car. If we now go back to our application, refresh this page, at the bottom you can see we now have the car manufacturers loaded into this field. So this is a model choice field. When you use a Django model form that's tied to a foreign key, in this case the foreign key on the user model is the car model, the foreign key objects are loaded into the model choice field, and by default they're shown in a select box like this drop down here. Now in this video we're going to customize this as we progress through the video. We're going to add the Select2 box to make this searchable. We're also going to override the default query set so that we're not getting all of the cars back but a subset of the cars. And finally we're going to learn how to select multiple cars when we are registering here. So we're going to change this model choice field into a model multiple choice field in Django. So that's coming up, but for now what we want to do is actually just handle the submission of this form. This is kind of like a registration form where the user fills in their username and a password, and they also add their car manufacturer to this registration form, and then they submit that to the server. Now what we need to do is go back to views.py, and within this register function we need to handle the post request. So we're going to check if the request method is equal to a post request, and in that case we're going to do things differently. We're going to create a form object, and we're going to instantiate the user create form and pass the post data into that form. So we pass request.post as an argument into the user create form. Once we've done that, we can check if the data that's been passed in is valid. We use the form.isValid function for that. And if it's valid, because the form is a model form, we can call form.save, and then what we typically do when we submit a form is we redirect the user somewhere else in the application. So I'm going to import redirect at the top, and that's from django.shortcuts, and we can pass a named URL in here. And what I'm going to do is go to urls.py, and we have a single path in this application for the register page. So I'm just going to copy that name and paste it in here. So when we submit the form, we're simply going to be redirected back to the register page. So a very simple form submission process here. We create the form and pass the post data in. We verify that it's valid, and then we save that data to the database. Let's now see if this actually works. If we go back to the page, I'm just going to refresh this page, and let's create a user here called user1, and I'm going to add a password here. And finally we select a car. I'm going to select McLaren, and we're going to submit this form to the server. Now you can see the page has reloaded. What I'm now going to do is go back to VS Code. I'm going to stop the server, and we're going to run the create super user command, and I'm going to create a user called admin who we can log into this application in the admin UI and view the objects that have been created. So we've created that user. All we need to do now is go to admin.py and register our models with the Django admin interface. So I'm just going to paste some code in here. From core.models, we're importing user and car, and then we're using the admin.site.register function to register both of those models with the admin. Let's now restart Django's development server, and we're going to go back to the browser, and this time we're going to go to the /admin page, and we're going to log in as this new admin user that we've just created, and we're going to be taken to this page. Now what I need to do is actually save admin.py and refresh this page, and you can see now that the models have appeared. Now we created a user with the username of user1. You can see that user is here, and if we click through to the user, and you can see some of that user's details here, if we scroll to the bottom, you can see that the car that's been selected here is the McLaren that we selected in the form. So it's correctly attached that foreign key just by selecting that particular element in the dropdown. And if we follow through to that McLaren object, it's a car and its manufacturer name is McLaren and the country is UK. So you can see that that's correctly attaching that foreign key, and it's doing so transparently by creating that model form, which under the hood uses a model choice field in order to attach the foreign key to that object. And just to prove what's happening here, we can go back to Django's shell, and I'm going to get the user that we just created from the database by calling user.objects.first. That gives us back this user model here, and what we can do is look at the car, and we see that McLaren on that, and because it's a foreign key, we can then follow through to the fields on that object. For example, the manufacturer. If we look at that, you can see we get back the string McLaren. So let's exit the shell, and what we're going to do is start the server again and go back to our form, and we're going to change up the form that we've been working with in this video. Instead of what we see here, we're going to use django-crispy-forms, and that's going to allow us to style this form a lot better. So let's go to the documentation for django-crispy-forms, and we're going to copy the pip install command, and we're going to bring that into the terminal below in order to install that application. Once we've done that, we can go to settings.py, and if we scroll down to installed apps, we're going to add crispy forms to installed apps here. And once we've added that, we need to add a crispy forms template pack here. If we go to the base.html template, and this is the base template in this application, this comes from the starter code, and you can see we have a link tag that loads up the Bootstrap 5 CSS. So we need to use a Bootstrap 5 template pack for crispy forms. And there is a Python package that will do this for you. It's called Crispy Bootstrap 5. So we can scroll down here, and again, I'll leave links to all of these below the video. We're going to copy the pip install command, and we're going to paste that into the terminal. Once that installs, we can go back to the documentation, and we're going to add Crispy Bootstrap 5 to installed apps. So let's go back to settings.py, and we're going to paste that in here. Once we've got that, we can finally come back to the documentation, and we're going to copy these two settings. That's the Crispy Allowed template packs and the Crispy template pack. We're setting both of these to Bootstrap 5. So let's go back to settings.py, and I'm just going to paste these below the installed apps and save the settings.py file. Once we've got that, we can go back to register.html. This is the template that contains our form, and what we're going to do at the top is load the crispy forms tags so that we can actually use these tags in this template. And then where we're rendering the form below, we're going to remove the as div, and I'm going to use the crispy template filter here, and then we can rerun Django's development server and go back to the browser, and we're going to see if this form changes and now that we're using that crispy template filter. So let's refresh the page, and you can see now that this form looks a lot better. And if we scroll down to the car, you can see we still get that drop down, that select box, and all of the cars are present in this list, and we can select whatever one we want to. Now you might notice when we have this open that you have to search for the car that you want to find. What we can do is add Select2 to this in order to make the drop down or the select box searchable. Now to use Select2, we also need jQuery in the application. So what I'm going to do is go to this CDN link, which I'll leave a link to below the video, and we're going to grab this minified version of jQuery 3.7, and we're going to copy that and go back to base.html, and just below the Bootstrap CSS, I'm going to paste that in there. So that's going to bring jQuery into the application. And what we also need to do is get Select2 as well. So let's go back to the browser, and we're going to copy these two tags, and we're going to bring them into the base.html. Just below the jQuery import, we can do that as well. So now in our base.html, we have Bootstrap, we have jQuery, and we have Select2. What we now need to do is add a script here that is going to look for the ID of our select box containing the foreign keys. That's the ModelChoiceField. And we need to call the Select2 function on that particular element in the DOM. So how do we do that? What I'm going to do to start with is go back to base.html, and just underneath this div tag I'm going to define a new block here, and it's going to be called script. And don't forget to end that block just below here. And what we can then do once we have this block is go to register.html, and we're going to override that scripts block in here in order to add a script that's going to use Select2. So what we're going to do within here is define a script tag, and we're going to target the ID of the element in the DOM that contains our car foreign key, and it's going to be ID_car. And what we're going to do is call the Select2 function on that particular element. If we go back to the form and we right click the car field and we inspect the source, you can see that select element has the ID of ID_car, and that is what we are referencing here with this jQuery selector. And the reason it's called ID_car, if you don't know this, if we go back to forms.py, the field in the form is called car. And when Django renders these forms in a template, it adds the ID prefix to the field name. So let's go back to register.html, and this simple line of code that we've defined should allow us now to search in this Dropbox. So let's save the file and go back to the browser, and we're going to refresh the page and close the developer tools. Now at the bottom you can see that this looks a bit different now. When we click that, we have this search bar at the top. So if I wanted to find McLaren, I can type into that search bar and it narrows down the options based on what I've typed. So now we have a working Select2 box that allows us to search through these options. Let's now move on and see how we can limit the query set of objects that appear in this select box. Now by default it shows all of the cars in the database. So if we go back to forms.py, when we create this model form and we create the car field in that, this is going to create a model choice field under the hood that links to a query set containing all of the cars by default. What we're going to do now is override that, and we can do that by setting explicitly the car field here and setting it to a forms.ModelChoiceField, and to that we can supply a base query set. So I'm going to do that on a new line, and we can do it with the QuerySet keyword argument. Now let's say we only wanted to have cars that were made in Germany or Italy in this query set. We can use the car.objects.filter function in Django, and what we're going to do is we're going to pass the country field, and we're going to see if it's in one of the values that we supply in this Python list. So we only want cars that are made in Germany or in Italy to be in this query set that is displayed in the select box. If we now save the file and go back to our form and refresh this page, if we look at the drop down below, you can see we have much less options now. We only have cars whose manufacturer is based in Germany or Italy. So what we need to do if we want to override the default query set is we can explicitly set the model choice field on our Django form, and then we can supply that base query set as an argument to that field on creation, and in this case it's car.objects.filter, and we're filtering down to only cars from Germany or Italy. So this is a model choice field in Django that links a particular model to a foreign key. But what if you want to potentially link multiple models to another model? For example, in this case we want the user to be able to select multiple cars in this form, and when we save the form it's going to save all of those car relations to the database. In order to do this, we have another form field that we can use. Rather than the model choice field, we can use the model multiple choice field instead. But let's see how to do that by default without explicitly defining it first. So what I'm going to do is rename the field here to cars in this form, and then I'm going to go back to models.py, and we're going to change up this foreign key here. Instead of a foreign key, we want to potentially allow the user to select multiple cars. So I'm going to get rid of these arguments, and we're going to change the foreign key to a ManyToManyField in Django. This allows one user to be linked to many cars, and it allows a particular car to be linked to many users. And we need to rename this field cars. That would make more sense for a many-to-many field. Once we save that, we can stop the server, and what I'm going to do is run the make migrations command in Django. You can see this migration removes the car field and it adds another field called cars to the user model. Once we've done that, we can then run the migrate command, and that will apply those changes to the database. Let's now run the server and go back to our form page and refresh this page, and we can see at the bottom we have this cars field. I'm going to make this a little bit smaller, and you can see we can now select multiple cars from this field. It doesn't have the best UI representation though, and this is actually the default widget for a model multiple choice field in Django. But it turns out we can use Select2 and select multiple elements with the Select2 dropbox. what we can do is we need to change the ID that's being referenced here. If we inspect the DOM for this field, we can see that the ID is now ID_cars, and that makes sense because in the form we renamed the field from car to cars. So we need to change the ID that's referenced in the register.html file. Instead of ID car, we are going to target the new ID here. If we save that and go back to the page, I'm going to close the dev tools and refresh. At the bottom, you can see we now get this multiple select field. So for example, I can select Audi here, and then I can go back in and select Alfa Romeo. We can select as many options as we want from this field. It's a model multiple choice field. And if we inspect the DOM again here, what it does is add this multiple attribute to the select element, and that therefore allows us to select multiple elements, and Select2 gives us a nice interface to do that. So let's now try saving this user to the database. We'll give them a username of user2, and once we fill the password out, we can submit this form, and we're going to then be redirected back to the page. If we go to the Django admin though, when we refresh this user list page, we can get this new user called user2, and when we go in there and scroll down to the cars, you can see that multiple of these cars have been selected, and that is the selections that we made on the front end. Each of them has been passed to Django, and each relationship has been created in the database. Now, just to show how this is done in the database, I'm going to bring up the database browser for SQLite, and you can see in the user table here that we have the user with the username of user2, and they have a primary key ID of 5. Now if we go back to the database structure, you can see there's a table here called core user cars, and this is the many-to-many junction table that links the users with the cars, and it does so in a way that allows as many of these relations to be created as possible. So if we browse that table, you can see the structure of that table. Each row has its own primary key, but importantly it has 2 foreign keys, one to the user table and one to the car table. Now for that user that we had on the admin, we created 4 cars tied to that user. One for Alfa Romeo, one for Audi, one for Lamborghini, and one for McLaren. If we go back to the database browser, you can see there are 4 rows in this table, and they're all tied to that user with the ID of 5, and there's 4 cars that are tied to that user. So what happens when you create a many-to-many field in Django is that a table is created in the middle of the 2 models involved, and that allows you to link a particular instance of one of the models to as many of the other model as you want. So with that said, we're able to create users with as many cars as we want in this database, as you can see here. Now there is one caveat I want to mention here. If we go back to Django's documentation for the user creation form, you can see a section here on what was changed in Django 4.2. In older versions, the user creation form did not save many-to-many form fields for a custom user model. So if you're using a version of Django that's older than version 4.2, you will need to handle saving the many-to-many fields yourself after you save the initial model. So if we go back to views.py and we go down to the code that is handling this post request, on line 9 here you can see we are calling the form.save method, and what form.save is going to do is it's going to create the user that's tied to this form, and that's because this is a model form, so it's going to create that user in the database, but the cars field on the user model is not actually translated to a column in the underlying database. Because it's a many-to-many relation, it creates that junction table in the middle of the user and the car models. And in older versions of Django, what you need to do is get the user that's returned from calling form.save. That gives us back that user who is now in the database with a primary key, and then you can create the associated records in this table using that user's primary key. So what we would need to do then is call the form.save many-to-many function in Django, and that will then handle saving the many-to-many relations to the database. So if you're using a version of Django less than 4.2, you will need to call the forms save many-to-many function in order to actually create these objects in the database. But in Django 4.2, this logic here is no longer necessary because the form class is smart enough to create the user model first, get the primary key, and then create the associated entries in that junction table. So we're nearly done with this video. I want to highlight one last example in forms.py. I want to show that we can also customize the ModelMultipleChoiceField. So what I'm going to do is change this to a ModelMultipleChoiceField. And let's say again we want to customize this query set. Let's remove the .filter function, and this time we're going to use the .exclude function. And we're going to exclude any cars that were made in the UK, so we're going to pass country equal to the UK as a parameter here. And I need to also rename this field here to cars. If we save that and go back to the form, you can see at the bottom we now no longer have UK based cars. For example, if we search for McLaren, that is no longer in the list. So that's all for this video. We've learned about Django's model choice field and also the model multiple choice field. This allows you to create a form field that's based on a foreign key or a many-to-many relation. And when you save a form with these fields, Django is automatically going to handle creating that foreign key entry in the database, or if it's a many-to-many field, it's automatically going to create the many-to-many instances in the junction table. And as well as seeing how to use these fields, we've also seen that we can use Select2 on the fields to make them searchable, and we can do this both with the normal choice field and also when we're selecting multiple objects from that field. So thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next video.